So yeah, welcome everyone, and to this, we're just having this kind of series of events, which are kind of partly Royal Holloway, Department of Media Arts, where I work. Oli is also at Royal Holloway in Geography, and also partly sponsored by 1968 Press, which is a new kind of publisher that we have set up, which kind of aims to publish critical theory and philosophy texts in the sort of old tradition of semi-text, or your sort of high, heavy, proper theory, but with a kind of political bent, so that these are theoretical texts that we consider to be sort of politically relevant and important today. There are a load of books if you want to take a look over there on that table, as well as the wine, which you should help yourself to. But the e-books and stuff are all free, so we're a not-for-profit. We're not trying to make a business out of 1968 Press. You can download the e-books for free of what we're doing. The next author we're about to publish is actually Alice Beckerho, who was married to Guy Debord. She's 82 now. She's super cool. She lives in Venice. And she has written an amazing book, which is going to be out in English for the first time, about the question of the ghetto, what a ghetto means, and the history of the ghetto. Venice had the kind of first ghetto, as it were, historically speaking, and it's a history of the Venetian ghetto, but also a question of what the concept of a ghetto is. And she's co-written. She's a poet, a theorist, author, massive part of the Situationist movement, along with her husband Guy Debord, obviously, but her book is fantastic, and that'll be out next. And then we're also doing a sort of series of events with authors that we kind of admire and like, one of which is Oli Mould, who has written this fantastic book, Seven Ethics Against Capitalism, which is out with Polity last year, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. Which kind of provides a sort of, in a sense, it's relevant even to our name as a press, because it's a sort of approach to capitalism post-68 and what capitalism has become, and what particularly this kind of brand of contemporary capitalism is. And Oli, in this book, suggests sort of 7 things, 6 of which I like, which is a good score, about how we can sort of combat capitalism and what to do with it today. So I think what the plan is that you'll talk for sort of 20-25 minutes about the book and its main arguments, then we'll have sort of questions and discussion and so on. And that's it. All right, over to you, Oli.
Thank you, Alfie. Just to say that I have got some slides here which you can all see, obviously. Probably not on the podcast, though, maybe. I don't know.
We can do.
Okay, well, we can put them on there.
We can have it, yeah.
So just to say, they are... they're kind of artistic representations of what I'm saying, sometimes more esoteric than others, sometimes they're quotes, sometimes not. So I'll leave you to decide.
Speak to them, because we can put it as a, just as a video feed.
Perfect. Perfect. So I think that, as Alfie said, there's never really been a more pressing time, I think, to theorise and indeed practice anti-capitalism. The half millennia or so of kind of rampant imperialist mercantilism that has mutated into this post-68 kind of nefarious neoliberal version of global capitalism is kind of now beginning to morph into this kind of dangerously fascistic form of kind of national wealth generation. And I think it's proved beyond any doubt, any reasonable doubt really, that capitalism does irrevocable damage to the planet, to the climate, to biodiversity, to democracy, and indeed to us as a species. And I don't think it can be tweaked. I don't think it can be changed. I think it needs to be removed completely. So while being anti-capitalist, I guess, is considered by some to be quite a radical move, I think perhaps now it's the most rational course of action. And I think the timing is pressing because I guess we're living through, and we're unfortunately still living through, what we can call an event. Not an event in the kind of traditional meaning of the word, but a rupture on a planetary scale. The pandemic, I believe, and as I kind of try and outline in the book, has ruptured the fabric of this sort of fragile and surface-deep status quo, and it's kind of brought to bear on the world a multitude of new subjects, new affects, new atmospheres, new ideologies, including an array of kind of alternative socio-political organisations that are an alternative to a kind of creaking capitalism. And I think this COVID rupture in the current fabric of capitalism is bringing all sorts of yet unspoken, or at least extremely repressed voices, from both those that sort of look for equality and those who sort of who try to seek to dominate the world for themselves, because that's what an event does. All the protests and the tumultuousness that we see around us today, They're about fighting for the realities, I think, that have been unleashed in this event to become the building blocks of whatever comes next after capitalism. So more justice for racialised people with the Black Lives Matter movement, climate action, defunding the police, the abolitionist movement, and even on top of that, all the kind of neo-fascists that we've seen in the streets, the escalating authoritarianism in national governments. They're all demanding that their voice be the ones that change the fabric of the world from one dominated by capitalism to a world that looks and indeed feels very different. But how to claim this better world, and indeed where can we even begin? Well, luckily, I think the answer actually lies all around us. They're just scattered, they're hidden, and they're diffuse. From human prehistory throughout capitalism's growth, and kind of all the failed revolutions of the past, the very real ideology of the commons has remained. So this is something I try to outline in the book, this idea of the commons. And fundamentally, the commons is that which we build by being together. So more than a natural resource, more than a forest, a lake or a field, the commons is the community that builds up around and beyond it. The society it creates and the continual act of democratising access and indeed sharing the gifts, if you like, of that resource to those who need it most. And indeed, building on the work of anthropologist Stephen Goodman and the geographers J.K. Gibson Graham, the commons can be thought of less as a unitary, singular, protected natural resource, such as a rainforest, a pasture, or an irrigation system, and more of a kind of dialogical creation between a resource and the community that it creates. This is what these authors have said. So in other words, to realise its emancipatory potential from capitalism's enclosure, the ontology and kind of the understanding of the commons requires a sort of deeper comprehension of their lived component, something that comes from the interaction between the place and the community that interacts with it. So without theorising common resources of being of the community, the commons as an ideology, I think, will be continued to be threatened by enclosure. And I think that's because we're still beholden to the sort of same global political economic logics that dictate the global institutions and the national governments, so market interests, and these interests ultimately trumping those of indigenous communities. It's just that for things like the supranational institutions, such as the Bretton Woods, the World Bank and so on, these logics kind of have agreed to collaborate via regulation to administer the scarcity of that resource. Now, don't get me wrong, it's kind of laudable to protect a resource from overuse, and indeed, it's helped protect rainforests around the world from deforestation, it's protected oceans from overfishing, and pastures from overgrazing, but it's not a functional mode of diffusing the commons throughout society so as to resist and indeed replace capitalism, because it's ultimately beholden to these market logics, however steeped in social responsibility they may be at the time. And this is what Eleanor Ostrom argues in her argumentation about the commons. So I think the institutions that govern these commons as they currently exist, they often restrict local indigenous communities from accessing the common resource, and they designate it instead as a protected area and assume a sort of stewardship role, dividing up the resources as they see fit rather than collaborating with local knowledge. So really it's a form of colonial commons. So this is what people like Stephen Goodman have argued, is that a commons doesn't exist until it is overlaid with a community of people and indeed things that freely access it. So Goodman argues that, quote, taking away the commons destroys a community, and in destroying a complex relationship demolishes a commons. So for me and for those other authors as well, seeing the commons in this way, sort of as a dialectical relationship, redefines both the commons and indeed the community. So now in 2022, I think it's an idea whose time has come. But in order for it to aid in the reconstitution of our planet and the healing that it requires, I think we need a planetary commons. And this idea is the coming together of all peoples and resources into a planetary, so not a global, not an international, but a planetary mode of socio-economic organisation that recognises our material, cultural, psychological intimacy with the planet that we inhabit and the human and non-human resources that it offers. So planetary thinking embraces the sort of difference of and in the world. And as feminist scholar Gayatri Spivak has argued, it resists the image of the globe or globalization as a kind of false totality. So practically, the planetary commons is kind of like a mode of organizing the world, or organizing communities, nations and societies that foregrounds the very ethical characteristics that capitalism defenestrates. So this planetary mode of organisation, it recognises our material and psychological intimacy with the planet as Gaia. So Bruno Latour has argued that he says we need to rematerialise our belonging to the world. So within this process, there is a necessity, I think, to resist totalising narratives that reduce the heterogeneity of the world's population into a single homogeneous entity. So as Latour and many other people like him have continually stressed, the nature-culture divide is a false one. And attempts by culture to curb and control nature is at the root of the kind of capitalist-induced climate catastrophe. So Planetary Commons rejects this idea. It rejects this divide and calls for a re-terrestrialising of our existence in the world. But how do we get there? What can we do? Well, I think to maintain the progressive utility of this rupture, and not to let it kind of scab over with the existing inequalities and perhaps something far worse, then we need to be ethical. But how do we do that? Well, I think there are ways of being, I think, that help us enact this particular fidelity to the progressive realities that have been uncovered by this COVID event. Indeed, for me, I think there are 7 of them. So the first one is mutualism. So there is more. This is more than sort of shunning neoliberalism and the Thatcherite individualism that kind of purports, that is built upon neoliberalism. It's kind of it's the reaffirmation of the social. I think, and indeed, we need to be radical than that. It's about philosophically and empirically understanding that there is a kind of physical, actually existing we. We can look to, I think, recent studies in neurobiology, which I do kind of quite a lot in the book, and they've shown how we're kind of inherently empathetic beings, and we have hardwired within us the capacity to be compassionate. And there are also studies in microbiology recently which have shown that we're anything but individuals, and we contain a kind of multiplicity of organisms that are actually indeed necessary for our survival. So we're actually anything but self-contained individuals. And so I think we need to scale this outwards. We need to be radically connected, as Deleuze and Guattari would perhaps argue, and resist egoism and selfishness, and thereby disarm capitalism's trump card of offering personal wealth and stardom to once subversive people. And I think there's a sentiment from a group of anarcho-feminists in Bolivia, apparently. The quote itself is unknown. These 2 people have kind of put it onto sort of artistic purposes, but it says, "Be careful with each other so we can be dangerous together." And I think this is the most important ethic of mutualism, because without it, activism will kind of fizzle out before it can even start. So secondly, we have transmaterialism. So to be a consuming body is to be human, and that which is to be consumed is non-human. So more and more things, and indeed people, in the form of slavery, colonialism, dehumanising racism, are demoted to the level of the non-human. And it is a demotion. And so and it's to feed that which capitalism dictates as the idealised body. So this capitalism of the Anthropocene is an extractive machine, and one that dominantly and I think violently dictates which non-human life is to be sacrificed on the altar of profitability, and which is not yet. So the conversion of, say, for example, sedimented dead organisms for over millions of years into oil renders them subordinate to the needs of the consuming human. The life of the Amazon rainforest is destroyed to make way for cattle grazing our palm oil plantations is deemed not worthy. Capitalism therefore dictates in real time what is human and non-human. So this idea of transmaterialism, and I use that prefix trans deliberately because of its agency in disrupting dualisms, is about levelling up, to kind of use a politically en vogue term, and the human, to levelling up the human and the non-human as equals. So practically this sort of trans-materialist ethic, and things like veganism, the right to repair, eco-squats, but ultimately it's about realising the potency of material in the world for creating and sustaining life. And Catherine Youssef, who is a geographer, she calls herself an inhuman geographer from Queen Mary. It's a great way of thinking about it. Inhuman geographer. She says, she quotes, an engagement with materiality is a source of communion with the formation of a collective in which materiality is a site of political struggle and solidarity rather than a constraint or break on the possibilities of life.
Could you give me her name again?
Catherine Youssef, so it's Kathrin So R-Y-N,
Yeah.
Y-U-S-O-F-F. Catherine Youssef. She's got a book's called A Billion Black Anthropocenes and One. It's like a little sort. It's brilliant, very good, very good book. So thirdly, and kind of relatedly, we have minoritarianism. So capitalism obviously dehumanises certain groups of people. It deems them dispensable and makes them resources to be consumed and or disposed of. So this dehumanisation is a violent process that kind of first designates animals as disposable and second reduces certain gendered, race and ethnic bodies to that level and therefore proclaims that they are disposable as well. So when politicians describe migrants as vermin or black protesters as animals, they're using this loaded language and a sort of broadcast platform to perform this dual process of dehumanisation. So for this ethic of minoritarianism, it's kind of fundamentally an ethic that of alignment with oppressed marginal subjects, whether we are ourselves marginalised or not, in order to understand how the oppressive institutions of capitalism work and how they affect the lives of everybody. So a planetary commons, and indeed the commoning process that kind of it entails, is energised by this new thinking, subjectivities, and it drives for equality that emanates from the margins of capitalist society. From Moses' emancipation of Jews from the slavery in Egypt, from the suffragettes gaining equal voting rights for women, the continual struggle for racial and equitable justice in the modern world, it is not bestowed upon people, it is always won from below. So, the ethic of decodification is the fourth one, the one that Alfie doesn't like. So, have you guys done your 10,000 steps today? Have you had your 5 a day? Our eyeballs are bombarded and tailored with shopping lists that are beamed directly into our social media feed, right? And even something as intimate as our sleep is being infiltrated by apps, coding and measurement. So I think to be anti-capitalist then is to sort of build the commons and resist the over-quantification and indeed the codification. And furthermore, it requires an active decodifications of things, a kind of uncoupling of the experience of codification with their sort of algorithmic ontologies and to engage in decodification. So I think activism, in much the same way that this slogan came about after the A-level fiasco, which is a slogan which I think needs to be resurrected, to be honest, it needs to make use of those atmospheres that are not codified and those forces that are barely perceptible but no less powerful. Where are we? Fifth, I think, is slowness. So capitalism is obsessed with short-term fixes, political terms, quarterly budget cycles and so on, because in doing so it secures its long-term goal of expansion and growth. So part of the appeal of capitalism is short-term gain. So I think to be subversive to it is to sort of think in the same time frame of capitalism, i.e. the long term, in order to counter it and resist the lure of the spirit of capitalism, which Boltanski and Chiapello outlined, came about post-1968, that's often kind of fueled by selling excitement and instant gratification. So it's quite kind of counterintuitive, or at least oxymoronical in a way, because in order to maintain its long-termness, capitalism makes us think in the short term. But in an age of social media and 24-hour news, there are certain subcultures and sort of social movements, I think, that we can actually lean on that help us to sort of be slow and to actually kind of resist the lure of the short term. So we can look to these slow movements like slow food, slow fashion, slow scholarship, slow cinema. This is The Gan, which is an amazing film about a train journey across Australia, like an 18-hour film. It's brilliant. And it's, I think they have inspirational ways of kind of rediscovering the lost virtue of patience. And I must admit, I found watching snooker recently has the same effect.
Snooker has a really strange slowness.
Slowness is brilliant. It kind of washes over you. Do you know what I mean? So I think to be subversive temporally is to insist upon slowness, a kind of denial of rapidity, slickness and hypermobility. I mean, it's a truism, but patience really is a virtue because impatience blunts solidarity. The sixth ethic is failure. So success is a mantra which is capitalism exudes at all times, right? The competitive self-interest that it's built upon means that failure is not an option unless it's a precursor to success. But to build the planetary commons is to utilise failure as a means of progress and resistance to the injustices of capitalism. So failing spectacularly in your specific goal does not mean the failure of a broader movement. Again, examples of the Parisian students in May 1968. They failed spectacularly at their immediate goal, which was kind of political change, but it is still considered extremely vitally important in activists in many disciplines. I mean, I still teach it to you guys in my third year course, so it's still something of incredible importance. That's because the energies of the movement have been transferred, or perhaps even dormant, but they can be directed beyond the scope of a place and time if connected with kind of radical ways. So failure isn't really necessarily death. I think it's life, if viewed as part of ongoing struggles. Then it becomes a sort of necessary process in making alternative futures possible. Indeed, failure is the gap between who we are and who we could be, and I think, therefore, is an essential part of activism. And I think Jack Halberstrom, who was lucky enough to be a part on the of my book launch, actually, for this, they came down, it was brilliant. Yeah, it was great. And they write this, they said, there is something powerful in being wrong, in losing, in failing, and that all our failures combined might just be enough, if we practice them well, to bring down the winner. Failure loves company. And then finally, the ethic of love. Which I would, your friend Shreko writes quite a lot about, and if you write about as well, don't you, about love sometimes?
I do, although I've never been in it.
So, the ancient Greeks had 4 words for love, right? They had eros, which is kind of the erotic love, where we, the statue of Eros is where we get the word from. We've got philia, which is friendly love, so topophilia, francophilia, and indeed the city of brotherly love, Philadelphia. We have storge, which is a kind of family love or bloodline love, although it can be replicated sort of through adoption or whatever. And the 4th version, though, is agape, which is a kind of unconditional love. So the focus of this particular ethic, which I write about, is this sort of Greek word agape, which pertains to the love of humanity for God and God for humanity. But such a love, I argue, need not be limited to a religious discourse, because it is a love that can propel activism further and further, because it is completely unconditional. So positive action without any kind of desire for reciprocal reward. So Jacques Ellul, who was a sort of prominent Christianist, argued vociferously for a love that was more than just generous giving, sympathy or piety. It was a radical love that forces us to forego the solid, comforting ground for the uncertainty of poverty, marginality, and the unstable ground. So it's a love that propels human agency to be focused on collective and social justice, and it fuels all the other ethics that have come before it. So being mutual, being material, being minor, being decodified even, being slow, being a failure, I think all require love. It's an energy that is contagious and it's powerful in its subversive potential. And as the situationist Raoul Vaneigem has argued, they say this: they say people who talk about revolution and class struggle without referring explicitly to everyday life, without understanding what is subversive about love and what is positive in the refusal of constraints, such people have corpses in their mouth. So in a world in which, I guess, hatred and division are becoming the norm, love is indeed revolutionary. So I think individually these ethics are kind of mindsets of ways to resist capitalism, but by being weaved together, they offer a tantalizing view of a better world in common, indeed a planetary commons. The coronavirus, coming as it did from a clumsy intrusion into the radical unknown of a kind of unsurveyed pathozoological realm, it shows just how related we are to the materiality of the world around us. A virus, it kind of occupies an interstitial state, doesn't it, between life and death. Viruses are neither alive nor dead. They're kind of the original zombie. And so whether a virus attacks a human body or a global body politic, it brings the human-non-human divide crashing down via kind of very noticeable symptoms of illness that are biological, sociological, and economic. In the last couple of years, we had wildfires that have choked the Amazon rainforest, the Australian continent, Canada and California, with intense breathlessness and rising temperatures. And so perhaps there's a sort of planetary extension to the coronavirus, the symptoms of which include breathlessness and high temperatures. But not to be outdone by the kind of asphyxiating symptoms of the coronavirus itself, the brutality of the police who murdered George Floyd, among others whose final words were, "I can't breathe," a slogan that became a rallying cry for millions of racialized people around the world. So from wet markets, viruses, anti-racist movements, rainforests, to anti-fascist movements, the billionaire space race, the carbon-soaked troposphere that rains down fires and floods, the COVID event, I think, has shown us how intimately connected the planet is, systematically and conceptually. So, yes, I think the COVID event is exactly that. It's an event that has brought new ways of conceptualising concepts into the world. And as the capitalist scene kind of continues to usher in this climate emergency, it feels certainly to me and to kind of many other people in the global north, in particular who are perhaps privileged enough to have been shielded from capitalism's worst atrocities over the years, it feels that the world is not just changing, it is rupturing. So what kind of world we build in the ashes of capitalism, I guess, is kind of up to us, not just us in this room, but us as a global politic. And as the activist and novelist Arundhati Roy has written in the Financial Times, of all places, she argues that the pandemic is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice, our hatred, our avarice, our data banks and our dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us, or we can walk through it lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world. And that's it. I'll leave it there.
All right.
Thank you.
The Financial Times nailed the...
Yeah, absolutely. The Financial Times of all places.
I suppose I'll ask a few questions and then see what other people want to join in with. I don't know whether to go sort of for big or small first. I think for big, with the planetary stuff, with the question of planetology, I mean, I'm definitely really interested in this question. And you mentioned also in one of the seven, I forget which, Spivak and her influence as a feminist model, but Spivak also kind of wrote about the planet thing and the question of planetology, and she, I mean, her argument about planet sort of abstractions of the planet is that they often include violence. You know, it's a typical sort of Spivak thing. It typically includes violence. You know, as soon as you start speaking about the planet, the way you speak about the planet inherits patriarchy, racism, and other ways in which, you know, when we speak sort of broadly about what the planet is, you're exporting a sort of Western idea that has histories of, you know, not just Western but also patriarchy, and applies that to this kind of, you know, notion of the planet. So how, in a lot of your book is going towards this, you know, planetary commons art as the sort of central argument. How does one kind of, or how could this planetary idea avoid simply applying concepts of that come from the patriarchal West, you know, to the planet as a whole?
I think it's because the concept of the planetary or the planetarity kind of, if we practice it kind of properly, includes decoloniality and thinking non-Western ways as part of its very ontology. So Spivak is right. There is a sense that if you think the globe, she says that word, the globe is on our computers.
That's
right?
it, yeah.
So I think there's a difference between global and planetary. So global is the push towards homogenization. It's the push towards abstraction. You know, it's the push, which is why we call globalization like McDonald's in North Korea. It's like everything is the same because that's the most efficient way of producing things, and it's the most profitable way of doing things. Planetary thinking goes in the opposite direction. It embraces difference and it embraces heterogeneity, which obviously includes, you know, the global south, marginal subjects, and the kind of the colonial world in the colonial world that is indeed embedded in the global north and outside of it. So I think that there's a difference to be said linguistically between global and planetary.
Yeah, that was interesting that you said that.
Yeah, I mean, just as a brief suffix to that, I would say that people like Elon Musk use the word planetary.
Yeah, right.
And indeed, we in geography we sit below the geosciences, and they talk about planetary, and it's often related to kind of drilling of oil and asteroid mining and off-world sort of stuff. So there is almost a kind of an appropriation of the term even before it's had a chance to breathe. But so there is a kind of movement to thinking about planetary as a sort of, you know, aerospace industry word almost. But I think that as Spivak and Goodman and others have argued, the planetary involves ethical thinking, it involves material thinking, it involves sort of an unideological thinking, like a reduction of the nation state and so on. So that's where planetary sits in that discourse. It's not international, it's not global, It's not world. World is very different. It's planetary.
Is what the, I mean, this is slightly off topic, but is what the word planetary is adding, or the differentiation between global and planetary, is it the sort of post-humanism that is involved in planetary thinking that isn't involved in globalism, which is quite humanistic?
Yeah, I think so. Sylvia Wynter has written about the planetary and some of her stuff. Sylvia Wynter, who wrote about being human and what it means to be human in, after slavery. I mean, she's a Jamaican scholar. She's in her 90s now, I think, Sylvia Wynter. So she's written quite a lot about this. And again, she argues that if we can redefine or reconceptualize the human as subject, that involves our relationship with the world and the material world. So redefining the human as being material as well as human involves a planetary thinking, because it involves the materiality of the whole world.
Yeah. No, I think that's...
So that's kind of where it sits.
No, I think that's a good and convincing argument. So obviously what my least favourite of your 7 ethics is, but should I tell you what my most favourite?
Go on then.
I think the mutualism thing is really interesting. I think for me, I wanted to hear a bit more about this one, because what I like about mutualism, although you also later in the talk used the word solidarity to refer to, you said impatience blunts solidarity. I also think that's interesting, and a good critique of the state Twitter, or the way in which the left functions, and the question of how solidarity and impatience function. That is not just a throwaway phrase, but also the question of the attention economy and digital media, and how solidarity is possible across these kind of borders, but bound by these kind of these kind of difficulties. But I suppose what I want you to say is, what's the difference between mutualism and solidarity, or why you've chosen this word mutualism instead of this kind of established communist term of solidarity.
Well, funnily enough, the term mutualism actually comes from a reviewer, because originally it was anti-individualism. It was originally it was a direct critique of self-interest, and so I took a lot of that out. And because the reviewer said, "Well, it's very antagonistic. Why didn't you call it something more forward-thinking?" And he said, "What about mutualism?" I was like, "Yes." And because I was, I'd just been thinking about mutual aid, and I've got doing some work around mutual aid groups and mutual aid networks in the pandemic. So that idea of mutualism, I think, does kind of have its roots in an anarchist thought, but solidarity is, and is Lily White? Anyway, the Australian Indigenous scholar, solidarity. What's the phrase that she uses? She says, if you've come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come here because your freedom is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And so I think that's what solidarity is. It's about understanding that we have common struggles, common problems that we work with together. And that's kind of what mutual aid does, and that's what mutualism does. I think mutualism is perhaps more, one step behind, if that's the right word. It's kind of building the network, building the kind of getting people together, building the networks, and then we can be...
So one could commit to mutualism even when you don't necessarily want to have solidarity with that person.
I guess so. I guess so.
Good,
I think that there's...
Is that because mutualism is a term of ownership? In England, it's the way that the working classes arranged insurance policies, life insurance is a particular example, early forms of mortgage allocation companies were mutuals. Well, not so early. I mean, Halifax was a mutual.
That's right, yeah. It's a word.
The 80s. So if you think that it's a capitalist term, it's about a kind of a form of capitalism in which the ordinary folk with some resource can join together to enable each other to buy homes or insure their lives or do other important things, which I think is better than having the mortgage companies we have at the moment. And lots of people do and have written in defense of it. But it's not the same as solidarity, where you might have no resource. You're on the picket line, you don't have a dime, You might have had a job and now you don't have it, or you might be trying to get a job. Do you know what I mean?
So mutualism kind of implies an exchange? Is that the...
Well, it implies putting your resources together to enlarge your capacities.
So it's that kind of growth by different meanings.
Do you agree? I mean, that history of the term.
I think that there's definitely an element to that, and I completely know where you're coming from with mutuals. I think I saw a Nationwide advert with mutuals on it. It does have that.
Yeah.
But that was that right.
I think Nationwide still is technically a mutual.
Well, yeah.
Although it's been bailed out very substantially by the British taxpayer.
But that's a joke about the sort of mutual friends on social media. Nationwide advert.
I mean, it does. I think there is a certain element of sameness to mutuals, and so far as you're at a meeting of mutuals, there's an assumed position of sameness, and so whether that's sameness in resources or sameness in identity. And in fact, the mutual aid project that I'm doing at the moment, Adam Badger, who's a postdoc on the project, has been talking quite well about the ways in which it almost becomes a transactional thing. So you help me and I'll help you, and that's kind of, you can slip into market logic quite quickly with that. So I have to say that perhaps there's a danger of that. However, I think that, if you bundle it with the sort of a lot of the philosophical musings, like particularly from Deleuze, but also from like Kropotkin and kind of the anarchist thought, where mutual aid, was originally a kind of term.
Was part of the history of anything that Kropotkin talks about mutual aid?
Yeah.
I don't know.
1902, 1903, a Factor of Evolution, a mutual aid, a Factor of Evolution is the name of the book. And in it, he talks about how Darwin's theory of evolution is wrong. And how actually it's cooperation of species that created. Because Darwin, this survival of the fittest is not a Darwinian. Darwin never said I was the strongest survived. Darwin was always like, it's those species or those individuals that are best adapting to change. That doesn't mean the strongest, it doesn't mean the fittest, it doesn't mean the biggest. It means those who are able to adapt to change. And what Kropotkin was saying, that actually that ability to adapt came about through cooperation of species, not competition of species. And he went down to Brighton and he looked at crabs he's got this amazing phrase of a crab is a comrade. Comrade crabs. And so he was arguing that mutual aid is far more important to evolution than we think. And actually his arguments were that Darwinism has been co-opted by economists and socialists, social Darwinism, to sort of push a particular self-interest agenda.
But then that feeds into the planetology thing, or the planetary commons thing, because you're saying that in order to survive, you have to collaborate with other species. As in, you think about humanism, you have to think about the collaboration with the planet and this broader sense.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what we're seeing right now. We can't. I was doing the master's session just last week on the planetary, and I was watching the Tongan volcano erupt. Did you see that? And you saw the images from space, and to me, it encapsulated the idea of planetarity, because it was visible from space for one thing. It was completely kind of, it was material. It kind of came from the guts of the earth, and it crossed international borders. And when you see it from that angle, you could see that it was a planetary process, but affected people on the ground, particularly people in the global south, in Tonga, right? And so it was a really, I'm going to say good, I don't mean good because it was horrific and it's killed lots of people, but it was an extremely eye-opening example of a planetary mode of thinking, because it dissected the scales of global, national, and local in an instant via an intense material engagement. Yeah.
It is really, this will be my last question before I ask and I would love to talk about slowness and stuff as well, but I suppose what I really want to talk about, based on the back of what you just said, is, how do you sort of, on the one hand, the localism is clearly part of, contemporary revolutionary practice, or, and in a certain sense, this is maybe too tangential, but the death of the Corbyn movement and so on, which one could sort of think of in planetary terms, it has made people focus their attention much more on local kind of activism and local anti-capitalism. And your book is about, ethics against capitalism, and localism is so much currently, right this moment, a part of how people try to combat capitalism and start from sort of basic principles. And yet the book is about the opposite of the local, I suppose. How do you see planetary and local as allies, or how does that?
You're talking to a geographer. Yeah. Of course, I've thought about this, but you're right. And I guess, well, there's a couple of ways to think about it insofar as a planetary mode of organisation, like I say, it kind of does away with scale altogether, and it sees the local as just another kind of node, or another kind of, to use Deleuzean language, a kind of assemblage of a planetary network. And there's a lot of the action, the agency happens within a locality, but that can spread. And this is where I kind of go against someone like David Harvey, who kind of all the traditional Marxist ideas, which are, we need to scale everything up. We need to scale up anti-capitalism to the national. And I've used that term before, but it's a Freudian slip. I don't mean scale up, I mean diffuse out. Because that you're using the networks that they stay local. They might cross oceans, but they stay local. Insofar as I'm acting in a mutual aid network in London with someone over in New York, and we're sharing resources, we're sharing ideas about how to feed the poor, or set up a community fridge in Brooklyn and in Spitalfields. And all right, there's a global kind of ontology to that, so far as we're using Zoom or whatever to talk that through. However, the practice and the agency are local, but they're not local because they're happening across different sides of the ocean. What's the best way to describe that? Well, it's planetary, because you're stretching it rather than scaling up. So that's kind of where localism sits in this.
No, that's good. Well, I do have more questions I really want to ask, especially about the digital thing, the codification. But let's see about you've got something on Deleuze, brother. I've been reading a lot. I've been reading a lot about the gig economy today. So the gig economy today. So that's what I'm going to kind of ask about. But it does link into like the decodification, slowness, and failure as like three core concepts. And I kind of like a bit of clarity on them, as I'm thinking particularly about like what ability do we have to say no to speed, to
just say no to drugs, kids.
To deny, or to this idea of decodification, slowness. It often appears as quite in kind of like self-help books, and sort of like as this kind of like neoliberalized kind of like just be one at nature, man, which I know is not what you're going for. But there is, I think, an important question for these kinds of ethics of how do we get access to this idea of being able to be decodified, to be able to act slowly, to be able to fail. Because, if I, as a reasonably comfortable middle-class person, fail, that sucks, but I will eat next week. But so what, I just kind of want some clarity on how those would functionally work at the moment.
It's a good question, and it's one that I kind of grapple with myself. And you're right about the self-help thing. I mean, in the book, I'm very clear that I kind of really just hammer home the point that cuddling fluffy bunnies during an exam period is all very well and good, but it's not going to sort of doesn't really attack the problem the students.
You historically have a petting zoo,
That's what I'm saying. During exam time, do you get petting zoos, right? It's like, come and cuddle a bunny. We're not going to do anything about this, the systematic kind of oppression of students and their pressure to get jobs and look amazing on social media and all this sort of stuff, and the mental health problems that all goes with. So there is an issue around that, and you're right. That's why I think that they have to be seen in conjunction, because the best example I can give, particularly of sort of something like decodification, or indeed sort of slowness to a certain degree, is you think about being at a football match or being at a concert. There's a certain palpability, there's a certain connectivity to that, there's a certain mutualism within a football crowd, for example, whereby when your team scores a goal, you have a visceral kind of response to that, which you can't codify. You can't write it down. You can't put a number on it. You can't, do anything else which kind of makes it captures it. But precisely because it's experienced by 50,000 people, or 60,000, whatever it is, And so that's why I think that collectivity, mutualism, or solidarity, whichever kind of term we end up using, is so important, because if you don't do things together, collectively, be that slowness or whatever, it ends up just being another axiom of capitalist desire, and it just ends up being swallowed by Red Bull or whatever branding agency comes next. So slowness is great, and we can do it on our own, but I think that like slow scholarship, slow fashion, these are all movements which are kind of trying to break a little bit with the kind of capitalist mode of production. You guys know Ines Keegren, who's a geographer. He's very, very, it takes like 15 years to write a book or write a paper and stuff. He's very deliberate about it. He's like, this is slow scholarship because it's important. And it's like he might not get promoted or get like the next big thing about it, but that's the whole point. It's like it's slow, and he does it with other people, and he gets, he goes into archives and he deals with materials and histories and everything else. So it's a collective endeavour, I think. If you try and do it by yourself.
Well, I think that Hugh's question also made me think that is slowness a luxury not everyone can afford, and how economic.
Which is why something I love is important, because if it's important to be slow, if like a gig economy workers are completely burnt out because they can't make ends meet, then it should be the big companies that enable to say, right, we want to be able to help you be slow, so we'll give you a proper wage, we'll give you sick pay, we'll give you whatever. So all these things are done so people can rest, people can kind of actually be slow. So that's why it's such a thorny issue. The moment you step outside one ethic, you need the next, and even beyond that, you need kind of like a whole different political system to actually put these things into motion. So it's not easy, and I'm not suggesting it is at all.
But I think that point you just made is really important for me to understand what you're doing, because you're not saying in the sort of self-help sense, these are 7 things you can do. Yeah. It's more like collectively, you need the other 6 to make.
Well, essentially, depending on what we're trying to do, and this is about how we get outside of capitalism to something else. There's original versions of the book. I was like, actually, maybe it helps us to kind of escape fascism, or maybe like it could have been an ethics of kind of particular emancipation, or I don't know, escaping domestic violence or something. But whatever the authoritarian kind of pressure is, whether it's religious discourse, it was a kind of idea that actually there are ways of escaping top-down hegemonic pressures, whatever they may be. In the end, it was like, well, actually, capitalism is the kind of root of all those hegemonic pressures. So it actually targets capitalism quite specifically. But suffice to say, I think that they are needed as a suite of ethics.
Could I offer a different point on planetary?
Yes.
When I hear the term, bear with me a minute, because you're the Deleuze guy, yeah. I've spent a couple of days reading Claire Colbrook on this stuff, and those of you who have know that my head is more or less done in. But reflecting from her standpoint up to a point, that the planetary, there are 7 planets in our solar system. There are countless rocks circulating around in other solar systems ad infinitum. Yeah, always hard to figure out what the infinite is. Really, so it's by definition infinite. And all of them are indifferent to the outcome that, is described as it's easier for us to understand the end of the human race than it is to understand the end of capitalism. Yeah. Now, we could provide bets on either side, and I'd be interested in all your bets on this. I'm really interested in this. Colbrook's point is the inhuman is the acknowledgement of the indifference of the stuff that isn't us to us, and we ought to get clever about acknowledging that. But even if we did, we would not redeem ourselves in time to do anything about it, because it's effectively geologically over, and the redemptivist terminology itself implies a kind of comforting ethics. Of resolution that isn't there in her view for us. It might be for us. I'm not speaking on her behalf, although I'm very interested in your take on this, because I'm part of a group editing an issue called Living with Extinction for the New Formations Journal. And if any of you are interested in writing book reviews, or totally get in touch with m.merck at RHU. So basically, it's the general truism is you couldn't sort out getting to 2.5 without ending capitalism. But my sense is that we're not going to sort out getting to 2.5. I mean, we're going to go way, way over 2.5. And will there be a moment where the capitalists actually say, as they do in that very fascinating book, The Ministry of the Future, okay, we're the international bankers, we'll figure out another scheme, thank you very much, we'll do it 30 years from now in the story, when an awful lot of bad things have happened. I don't see capitalism ending, and nor do I see climate catastrophe ending. There's a race between the two, maybe not. And what I do think is that the forecasts of we do these 7 ethical things, which I totally support, I totally think you're right to proffer them as advice for us. Not without question. I don't have any picky attitudes towards them. But I don't have those picky attitudes toward them because, in a sense, I see that I'm older than you all. I can see what a lifespan looks like. And I think a lifespan looks like being as decent as you possibly can to people, because what else can you fucking do? That is your redemptive possibility. And nothing more than that, in my view. And what I'm really curious about is how do you feel about that? Does it make you sad? Does it make you elegiac? Do you still think you know a way around this? Because I can't see one.
Wow.
Wow.
Let's just get drunk. I see where you're coming from, but capitalism, I mean, it's only really existed for 200 years in its current state. Am I being unfair?
I mean, I don't know. I don't know.
500 years maybe?
I think like Mem said, like the Mark Fisher thing, capitalism, we can't really historicise it because the way we think of it, the way we think is so conditioned by the conditions of capitalism that we're unable to imagine.
But suppose you take, since you're interested in slavery and colonialism, suppose you take it to mercantile capitalism, which would be maybe 1300 or something.
Yeah.
So that gives it a longer history. That's people lending each other money to go out and trash somebody else's country and bring them all back and enslave them and steal their stuff. Okay, which is pretty much how we still think about it.
No, I get it. And my point is, I guess, that that's relatively short when in the kind of geological timescales that we're talking about.
Right. That's
and you're right. The planet will survive. We're not killing the planet. We're killing ourselves. What if 2.5 or 5.5, whatever, and it burns us all to a crisp? 1,000 years, 10,000, 100,000 years later, the planet will be absolutely fine, and the next species will thrive, depending on whatever the hell that is. So the planet is fine. It's us who are killing it. So it doesn't require a great deal of change. I don't think. I mean, I'm relatively optimistic. I don't share your pessimism because I think that there's a vocal minority at the top who are kind of. I see it as again, this might be my kind of optimism coming through too much, but they're like a wounded animal. Like an animal that's on its last leg, is dying, and it's just lashing out at anything it can to try and kind of grab hold of some sort of means of survival. I just think they're in the dying embers, and they're being as horrible and as fascist as they can in order to try and hold on to any power. I mean, look at just this country. Look what they're doing. They're lying, they're cheating, they're denying basic logic.
Yeah, right. So you're saying capitalism could implode before the climate would provide dependent.
I've got to think that.
Yeah. No,
I have 2 children. I can't. Maybe that's just me being naive, but I just can't. I refuse to think any other way, because if I did, then I would just why don't I buy a bigger house and a faster car? go on more holidays because I'll be alright. Do you know what I mean? I have to think that. If no one thought about that, we'd have been dead a millennia ago.
Well, could I invite? I'm very interested in how people younger than me.
Do you want to follow up here and then we'll see what...
Well, all I was going to say is that there is this perception that contemporary governments are lying more, and or is that true? Are they lying more? Like, is
maybe we just know that more. I don't know.
But like, in response to your question, like, do I have hope? Depends on the day. But I guess one of the things that I'd say about like the 7 ethics that you put forward is that they are compelling and I think important in an anti-capitalist society. But I'm not sure we've got an answer to how we get to that anti-capitalist society. And the best one's probably still bloody revolution. If we want to be realistic about what would actually, even that's not that realistic. They've got tanks now. But I guess the sort of, if I have whether governments are lying, whether all these things, all this violence, none of it's particularly new. It's been constituted the whole program of capitalism. I think it's easy to sort of look back at the post-war period and be like, oh, that was great. It was an aberration of capitalism. It isn't the gig economy as it exists now is more like work before the war than it was.
Yeah, piecework or day work.
And I guess.
Well, I've had these conversations with my PhD students too, which are sat in the back there, so they'll be able to maybe give a view which might be somewhere in the middle of all this. I don't know.
What are you asking?
And we've chatted about capitalism and what to do with it and how to stop it. Reece is doing stuff in the Olympics and how it's kind of commandeered sort of forms of extreme sport and stuff. And it's the same process, you like skateboarding, whatever. There's a certain kind of anti-capitalist or subversive subcultural stuff to it, and yet here we are, 2022, and they're being told to be competitive. They're being told to be sort of this, that, and the other, and it's happening in all forms of life. Actually, there's pushback, right? There's kind of it's not quite as total as or all-encompassing as it is, right? So I look at some of the stuff that you've been looking at. I think actually that's pretty cool. That's actually kind of like they're breaking the system a little bit. Maybe I don't know.
What about the Olympics? I don't know anything. Is that you doing a PhD on the Olympics? Yeah. My daughter was watching this recently. It wasn't a winter or I don't know what it was. The most recent Olympics that was on, and I saw also the skateboarding and. There were some other extreme sports on there, and I was like, because I would never encourage my daughters to watch the Olympics because I feel like it's part of nationalism and it's just the most predictable, But when I saw those, I was like, listen, look, you could be skateboarders, And then she was like, she's only 6, She's like, Charlotte won this skateboarding. She was 13 when she got really into it. But then obviously I am being tricked there, aren't I, into this kind of capitalist sort of territorialising of extreme sports and taking them away from their subcultural roots and making them into this kind of product. Is that your... what do you think?
I think that examples like skateboarding and stuff like that obviously is kind of completely bound up with the core industry that surrounds it in so many ways. And things like the Olympics do just kind of the point, when an activity is in the Olympics, the point of it is to kind of be the best and to be the ultimate individual, right? But things like skateboarding, although they are kind of bound up in this industry and are now part of the Olympics, they are still kind of just hanging out and being friends and kind of giving examples of mutualism, I think. I don't know if you agree, maybe it doesn't go as far as that, but I think it shows that there are ways of kind of being anti-capitalist. I don't think I'm being too strong if I say that in the case of skateboarding, but
I think
that despite kind of being bound in such a kind of totalized or seemingly totalizing system.
Like I said, pockets of this stuff, aren't they?
Yeah, and also maybe it is kind of impossible to see the end of capitalism, but I don't think it really means that. you should, you should don't use things like that.
Have any of you ever been to Arsenal Stadium? No.
We live near there,
Yeah, okay. Well, I live very near it as well. Okay. Well, then you know that Arsenal is surrounded by a kind of plaza. Yeah. And which, for instance, the names of the dead Arsenal supporters, as well as many players who ought to be dead, in my view, they're playing, so possibly they are. Anyway, are inscribed. And what has happened, it was happening before COVID, but it greatly intensified, yeah, is that skateboarding, rollerblading, running around with or without your dog, the stadium. I can do like 2 circuits without dying, that's about it. Boxing. Strong gym workouts with different tools are all done in the bits of overhang that surround the stadium and the stairways up and down. Yeah. Inside is capitalism. Yeah. Yeah. It's how much it costs to buy the tickets. It's how much is at the moment. Visit Rwanda is the tourist board that's supporting the shirts. I tell you, 30 million for that shirt subscription is not coming from an unlaundered source in Rwanda, which has a very small tourist industry, because it's not very big of a place. Yeah.
30 million? 30 million to put the Visit Rwanda?
Yeah, to visit Rwanda on the shirts, right? Outside it is this festival of, the stuff we do, which is fun, right? Yeah. And kind of only through COVID, it was one of the few bearable places, really, because Islington isn't well supplied with places to go and play. Yeah. Okay, so in that skateboarding competition, or is it competition, I watched a guy, and they're getting older and older. I mean, there is a deal about geriatric male skateboarders. They're not getting more female, because women are not idiots enough to try it, in my view. Tell your daughter, think about her nose, her arms, her legs. But anyway, this guy was perfecting the thing where you down on one side, flip the board around, and then land on the other. And I thought, I wonder how long it's taken him to do that. I was waiting for him to crash. He didn't crash, and he had to be over 25. I thought, you fool. But okay. But what I think is there's a competition, there's a level of competition. Even I think maybe my personal best could be more than 2 circuits around the stadium, There's a self-engaged competitiveness, and there probably are people who want to rollerblade better than the other people and want to do trickier tricks than the other people. There have to be. Only in Arsenal, where the players are doing the worst job possible, inside the stadium being paid $350,000 a week, or is everybody letting everybody down, But, what I don't understand is why don't people think about that more? I mean, because I'd like to have the whole place restored to us as a park, and not have, but maybe the people that go to the match, and they did go to the match yesterday and watch a 0-0 Tory, but the number 20 on the list, the bottom of the entire thing, maybe they thought that was worth it, but I don't think so, because they booed the team off the field. Yeah.
Was that just a rant against Arsenal? I mean, that's the best kind of critique I've heard of. They play like they're dead. I think.
I also live in Finsbury Park, so this is very familiar to me. But I don't support Arsenal. So. But I think this point, the question of capitalism and social space, is really important, and how you get this kind of accidental use of the space, which maybe has some anti-capitalist kind of features to it, but then maybe it doesn't. Maybe it just ends up kind of conforming to the...
Well, Arsenal could have done something even more. They could have been it more egregiously. They've sort of passively allowed this to happen. They didn't have to allow it to happen, which I think is very interesting. And apparently there's a man in charge of social relations in the community that could have done even more to further that. I think they should put basketball hoops up around the thing. I think that would be really fun, and everybody would come and shoot.
Football clubs are a very interesting kind of capitalist entity, because they sort of sit in between a corporation and a charity. If you think about a football club, like they spend millions and millions and millions of pounds on players and contracts, and then if there's a certain sort of group of people, the fans, who are unhappy for a completely non-sort of commercial reason, they sack the manager and they spend another £100 million on it. A completely irrational form of kind of spending, if you like. And at the same time, so they operate in this kind of weird sort of neoliberal sort of thing, which is the Premier League. They act as corporations, but they make decisions which are completely kind of kind of capitalist, if that makes sense. And then on top of that, they have to be considered community kind of centres. So they feed the hungry, they have community, they have, and so they're weird kind of setups, I think, football clubs.
But they were mutuals. They were clubs
Well,
of the neighborhood, or the club of the local factory in the Arsenal case.
They were working class. They were working class environments where people went and kind of the factory workers and all that. They get together. So it was born out of a kind of working class mutualism, which obviously has a basis in kind of anti-worker sort of stuff.
But it was also meant to stop workers from drinking.
Yeah, what happens is it's January 2022. This is what I think. I honestly believe that the next election in the UK will be decided by football fans. And you're seeing something enormous happening in the football community now. This massive politicization of football. It's visible in the sort of small, at the moment, quite small level. People like Gary Neville joining the Labour Party and so on, and Matt Letizia being a pro-Brexit, Farage type. But what you're seeing that is about to become football is about to become politicised in the next 2 years in a way that it's never been before. And it's going to influence actual politics with a capital P, in a really direct way. I think that football fans will dictate who wins the
Did you see the Leeds fans calling Boris Johnson?
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
And the darts fans as well. The darts people were chanting. When you've got the darts fans and the football fans calling you up.
But I think that stuff was fantastic. But I mean, I'm old enough to remember cultural studies when it did subcultures, back in the 70s, and people identified those pockets of resistance and remaking of community and brilliantly, and it was all real stuff, and you can see that, just the good Marcus Rashford has done as just one person, in this, or all the taking the knee effects, I think, to really genuinely change the public's attitudes of this. But it isn't ending capitalism. Capitalism is embracing
The thing is, all these kind of arguments about, it used to happen this way and it used to happen that way, it's no different now. It is different now because we have climate catastrophe, which has opened Pandora's box in this eventful way, took the kind of bad joke I think about an event. It's completely kind of viralised our world insofar as everything that we do, we know has a knock-on effect around the world, even if we don't see it. Every time we take a flight, every time we send a tweet, every time we do anything, it belches a little bit more carbon into the world, and we know it's going to impact people in the global south far more than it will us. So all these arguments about, it was just the same before the world, it wasn't. Because we understand that we are connected. We understand that the world is fucked if we don't actually do anything about it. And I think that is the driver. That's what makes capitalism different, or the demise, or what people, the projected demise of capitalism different. It's because we have to do it. Because we understand now as a global politic that if we don't, we are all dead. And I don't think that was a discussion 50 years ago, 60 years ago, with cultural studies and pre-war gig economy.
But today Alex Sharma was reported saying that nothing had been done to follow up any of the declarations in November. So, and it's been quite a while for nothing to have been done,
Well, I think, that's,
Well,
that's where I'll cut the recording when you say that. Any last questions from anyone for Oli?
I was just going to build on this idea of Marcus Rashford skateboarding and this kind of idea of the future generation, and so we've got this kind of hope that's the golden thread bringing together these 7 ethics, and that's what we're hoping to pass forward to this next generation of thinkers. But then when they've got things like Marcus Rashford, who is obviously doing so much good, he is probably the definition of mutualism within the football community, but then he's also being put into campaigns like Burberry, Nike, Adidas, and this kind of commodification. Same with skateboarding as well, whereas that kind of commercialisation, commodification, co-option of that kind of sense and these ethics. So if you were going to be speaking to people in the future, these kind of beginners to these 7 ethics or this planetary thinking, what would you be saying as what to look out for to kind of spot this greenwashing, art washing, sports washing? What would you be saying to look out for in that process?
That's such a good question. It's a really important question.
I think I've asked you to about this before. I don't know an answer to this because I told you before. Yeah, I don't know. It's a really good question. How do you spot co-option before it begins? And this is, I must admit, that's kind of originally why I was thinking this way. It was like, what is it that we do? What can we do to understand when capitalism begins to kind of put its claws in? And I always fall back on the idea of collectivism and all that, because Rashford, you're right, as an individual, he's doing all this amazing stuff, but you're right, he does then become the face of Burberry or whatever. You know, that's because he's an individual, and you know that's kind of how capitalism kind of initially works. I think that if you know, he could obviously do stuff like refuse that. I guess that could be the first start. But actually, all the kind of good that he's doing is perhaps unrecordable almost. He's inspiring people. Same with Greta Thunberg and many other people. You know, it's almost as if we have to sacrifice one individual for a greater movement. It's almost as if he's like a lightning rod, I think. Like Greta Thunberg as well. Like the climate action, it's like if she takes the shit and the insults from Donald Trump, then it's almost as if like, you know, she's the sort of the martyr for this movement. And every time she does it, and every time Marcus Rashford gets told off by Boris or whatever, there's been another group of people that will say, actually, yeah, no, I'd like to know more about what he's doing. So I think, I don't know, that sounds idealistic, and maybe it's not quite that kind of hard and fast, but I think there's some truth to that you almost have to sacrifice certain groups of people, or one person, or you have to give over a little bit of your movement so you know it's going to get done. Maybe a little less every time until eventually, you never know, it might end up not being happening that way. So it's never going to be a flick of switch. You know, this revolution, I don't think will ever come. It will come through slowly eroding it. And maybe that's one of the sort of processes. You just have to give a little bit of individualism every time, and then just over time it might be less and less and less. But yeah, I don't know. It's a good question. I'm not sure to answer.
I totally get the co-option thing with Rashford. I do, and with other, and I'm definitely worried about co-option in general. But I suppose what I wanted to just quickly say is that there's a certain kind of manipulation of emotion that's positive, you know, that's going on with that. Like, I'm a Manchester United fan, and when Rashford gets the goal instead of, you know, Cristiano Ronaldo, who's a rapist that should be in jail, I feel great, and I feel that I am attaching my Manchester Unitedness to something which I can also sort of think of as politically, that sort of emotional drive. I mean, this is also an extremely controversial example of this kind of thing, but I would also think of Michael Jackson's philanthropic songs like Earth Song and Save the World as part of this kind of attempt to use pop music to move emotions in a certain direction. So in that case, you know, it just towards kind of giving to charity. But I think that, you know, there is something really important about movements which try and co-opt existing emotions. So there's a reverse co-option going on in what Marcus Rashford's doing. It's co-opting the emotions that are directed towards football and redirecting them somewhere else. In a way, that's more important than the fact that he sort of is co-opting himself by Nike and Adidas and so on.
I was at the World Transformed in September, and I did one of the sessions on mutual aid, and the subject of Marcus Rashford came up again. It was like, well, why doesn't he? The debate was like, well, shouldn't he be a politician? Shouldn't he be a kind of? And I guess it's the same kind of thing. You know, whether he becomes a Burberry spokesman or a fashion model or a Labour politician, it's that same kind of movement into an individual.
Yeah, the emotion factory. That's right. Yeah, exactly.
He needs to resist both.
Yeah. Anyway, I mean, I think that's
But, you know, to be fair to Marcus Rashford, I agree with the idea that the individualization of certain heroic figures or martyr figures, as you were also citing, it will not take us where we want to go.
No.
In fact, I'm fascinated by that because that is what melodrama is, and I just did a book talking about precisely that. Highly, silhouetted moralism that Julian Assange got forced into, and Edward Snowden got forced into, as well as, film people. But, nor are they attempting to end capitalism, nor would they want to. They would like to have an elitist capitalism that paid them well enough to buy a house for their mum, who never had one, and some other nice stuff. And nor Gary Neville himself said that he wants to be a centrist in the Labour Party.
Yes, he did. Yes, he's extremely interested.
To be fair, Greta Thunberg has called for the anti-capitalist.
I'm not saying.
Yes, she has. Greta Thunberg is deeply anti-capitalist. But I think most of the figures that we cling to are decent social democrats.
Yeah.
And what I'm interested in is, are we willing to settle for social democracy? Because the thing is, as far as I can tell, it probably won't inhibit going up to about 4.5. Yeah. Yeah. It'll slow it, but not enough, for instance, for us not to shoot people at seawalls when they try to come and live here because we think there's no more room, in John Lanchester's book, The Wall. But I think in a very plausible scenario, given that Priti Patel would practically do it tomorrow if we gave her a gun. Please God, don't do that. So, you know, what I see in the short term is asymmetrical warfare on the terrorist tradition between people who really, really need not to live anymore in the tropics because it's killing them, and our attempts to keep them from coming to wherever we don't want them to come. Yeah, and that will start with some really dramatic asymmetrical warfare if I invoke the kind of melodrama of the Ministry of the Future, which is, I think somebody will get a dirty bomb, you know, and it will go on from there. And I don't understand why that hasn't already happened, given how bad it is for those people, quite frankly. And on the other hand, I imagine the LRB, which used to be, you know, pretty middle of the road, giving 2 positive reviews to how to blow up a pipeline. 2 in the same issue, not 1, not a debate, which is what I expected. 2. Yeah, and now saying, well, you know, well, why aren't we doing it? You know, well, don't do it yet for me because I'm actually depending on the piped gas to warm my house. That's right. You know, can we wait? Can we wait, please? No, there's enough alternative energy before we blow them up.
The question of whether Gary Neville can deliver us from climate crisis is difficult. But,
Maybe we should tweet that to him.
Maybe you can get him to speak up against, you know, his friend David Beckham's support for the, I don't think a good friend of his, by the way.
Qatar.
The Qatar.
Yeah.
I mean, Qatar is a good place where the sports people really have to.
No, this is not. This is a topic for the pub, but you know, Gary and his brother Phil have fallen out over the Beckham support thing. Phil Neville is out in Miami doing anyway. Anyway, let's look. Please, I'm going to probably go to the pub. Do you want to go to the pub for one?
I will go to
If people want to join us in the pub or help yourself to a glass of wine, please do. If you can, thanks, Oli, for
Cheers,
being
Alfie.
If you have books or things you want to push on this issue,
here.
we're looking